Hello and welcome to Quadriga. Donald Trump is packing his bags for Asia. The longest trip of his presidency so far. It won't be an easy one, even though he does plan to do some golfing in Japan. The most important stop is China, where he'll encounter his newly exalted counterpart, Xi Jinping. The recent Communist Party Congress wrote the Chinese president's name and dogma into the Constitution, cementing his status as on a par with the nation's founding father, Mao Zedong. Xi is behind a course that has seen China doubling down on projecting power economically, politically, and militarily. And Trump? Nearly a year after his election, he has little to show in the way of domestic success, and abroad he risks isolation with his policy of America first. America backs off, China steps in? That's the question we pose today on Quadriga, and here to answer it are our guests. It's a pleasure to welcome Gudrun Wacker. She's an expert on China and security affairs, and she says Xi Jinping projects an image of China as a great power that can offer the world a new approach to tackle problems and is ready to take more international responsibility. Andreas Kluth is editor-in-chief for Handelsblatt Global, and he says China's time horizon is much longer than Donald Trump's. On that scale, China is certainly a rising power while America is stagnating, and that's not a good thing. And a great pleasure to have Shi Ming with us on the show once again. He's a freelance journalist from China, and he says whether China will become the next superpower depends how other parts of the world position themselves. For example, Europe. And I'd like to start with you, Shi Ming. Xi is the new strong man of China, apparently, but will China emerge stronger as a result of his policies?
To be frank, we don't know. There are very, very contradictory signals coming now from China. On the one hand, the economy is facing a deepening crisis. We see that the money valves are opened up since 3 or 4 years, and still the growth is stagnating. On the other hand, the expenses are increasing very quickly, not only for military purpose, but also for insurance purpose, for stabilizing the society, for fighting against ecological problems around. From that point of view, I'm not very sure whether Xi Jinping's policy, to organize the market, but dominated by state, whether this policy would succeed.
In that sense, would you say that the international press is overreacting when they say that Xi Jinping is the new Mao Zedong?
Yes, certainly. If we just compare Mao Zedong in his last 2 years, he was dying, but nobody dares to say anything against him. Nobody dares to say anything against his policy. And his henchmen just stated this, that happens instantly. We could also compare Xi Jinping with Deng Xiaoping. Deng Xiaoping traveled in 1992 to South China. The man didn't have any office any longer. And he just gave 2 very short interviews. And instantly we experienced a great wave of reform and opening up policy. But Xi Jinping had gathered 13 officers only of his person. But we see that he could not get through so much, not a part of them, what Deng Xiaoping could afford.
Gudrun Wacker, some doubts there that we've just heard about how strong this new strongman really is. Your opening statement says that that Xi is making an effort to project an image of China as a great power and to offer a new approach. Now, for years, the international community has been calling on China to become a stakeholder, to really take responsibility in the international system. Would you say it is now prepared to do that?
Selectively, yes, it is. But I have to stress, selectively. So it's not ready to take over the position of the United States, for example. But I think we see that in the last 5 years under Xi Jinping, there is more self-confidence and more effort to really contribute to certain global issues. Peacekeeping is one of the examples where China has really stepped up its profile and where we see that it becomes more active. And it's important to see that if China talks about responsible stakeholder, it has the right, or thinks it has the right, to define what responsibility means. So it will not just do what the West expects it to do.
Certainly here in Germany at the meeting of the G20 powers in Hamburg this spring, Xi Jinping was making every effort to look like the great protector of the climate treaty, just as the U.S. Was deciding that it wants to get out of the Paris Accord. Andreas Kluth, would you say that this is going to be a bumpy process, this process of adjustment as China rises and America, as you said in your opening statement, stagnates or declines?
Absolutely. And first of all, it was interesting, not just in Hamburg with respect to climate change, but even before that in Davos, with respect to world trade, he's positioning himself as the successor to the old American leadership of the world order, which is very fascinating. From China's point of view, is of course incontestable that China is gradually reclaiming its historical place as world leader. They think back to the Tang dynasty and beyond, and they think of the last few centuries of Western dominance as an aberration. But I also know, I mean, you said, will it be a bumpy ride? It'll be a very bumpy ride, and the Chinese leadership is, that's a good thing, aware of this. I'm told that the Chinese leadership has been fascinated for years by studying periods of history, because usually what you get when one world power stagnates or declines and another rises is, unfortunately, war. And apparently they're especially interested in studying the late 19th century, when Germany rose and the British Empire stagnated, and that led to tensions and eventually war, because, of course, their whole thing is about peaceful rise, about avoiding that. But the bumps will be there, and I'm sure we're going to get to them. Can you avoid conflicts of interest, especially when there is someone like Donald Trump on the other side? The other reason why it's going to be bumpy and not entirely a good thing is Chinese rise does not mean the rise of the values or ideals that the West has traditionally stood for, even if we've hypocritically not honored them, but at least that we strive for. I think China makes no pretense at all that this will be a more democratic or just world.
Okay, let's talk about some of those bumps. A year ago, Donald Trump, we remember back to the time just before the election, was doing a lot of China bashing. But following his first meeting with his Chinese counterpart at his Florida resort home, Donald Trump indicated that the two of them could become the best of friends. At least some of the time, at least, he is now singing Xi Jinping's praises. Let's look at how this relationship is evolving.
For Donald Trump, the biggest threat to the U.S. economy is China. The meeting will be a difficult one, he tweeted before Xi's visit in April and complained about the high trade deficit. China warned of a trade war. But at their meeting itself in Florida, there was the appearance of harmony and the following presidential insight.
We've had a long discussion already, and so far I have gotten nothing, absolutely nothing. But we have developed a friendship, I can see that. And I think long term, we're going to have a very, very great relationship, and I look very much forward to it.
At that meeting, both Trump and Xi were able to save face. Has Trump learned from that?
Shi Ming, after the party Congress, Donald Trump said that Xi Jinping had emerged as something like the king of China. And he said in the same interview with Fox News that he thinks Xi is a, quote, very good person. How would you say Xi Jinping and the Chinese leadership would be reacting to these statements from Donald Trump that are nearly fawning?
I suppose they are not going to react at all. Because they know how Donald Trump can be unpredictable. They know that Donald Trump is, to be very frank, a good how to say, Donald Trump could play with pressure, very different kinds of pressures. This bashing is one sort of playing blackmail. And this game with North Korea, with South China Sea, could also regard it as building up a huge stage of pressuring China. And then...
Are you saying, in other words, they don't trust Donald Trump?
No, not at all. But Donald Trump doesn't trust Xi Jinping either.
Does anybody trust Donald Trump?
I don't think so.
And Andreas Kluth, Donald Trump said in the interview that I referred to just now that he has the best relationship with Xi Jinping of any president. Would you say that is true? And what accounts for this radical change in tone over the course of Donald Trump's presidency?
I mean, honestly, between his tweets and his statements, this is showmanship. I mean, that it means absolutely nothing. I think Xi Jinping, we often in the West think that the Chinese have a plan and everything. I do think Xi Jinping will run circles around this man intellectually. So does Angela Merkel. So do they all. I don't think anyone reads any, places any currency on Donald Trump saying we're good friends now after this meeting. So I think they just disregard that and get down to long-term interests, power calculations. Both Angela Merkel and Xi Jinping, I think, do it that way.
So, Gudrun Wacker, aside from the overall notion of trust, what kind of relationship do you think we might see evolve between these two leaders and also these two countries? Certainly, one of Trump's big issues has been trade and particularly Chinese steel. Since the election campaign, he has talked about possibly putting punitive duties on Chinese steel. So far, it hasn't happened, but do you think the last word has really been spoken?
No, the last word has not been spoken because this is one of the topics that Donald Trump really seems to care about, the unfairness of all the free trade agreements that the United States has signed in the past. We have none with China, but there is this huge trade deficit, and so this will remain a topic, I'm sure. But there are other topics that sort of overshadow or take priority over this. Also, I mean, the US at the moment has its hands full to renegotiate NAFTA, so this will probably keep it busy, but they already introduced punitive customs on aluminum foil or something like that. So the measures are starting, but they're not really, it's not a trade war yet. So this will remain structurally so. And also in terms of strategic thinking, the strategic ambition of the other side, I think this is where the major mistrust between the United States and China comes from, that China doesn't trust the ambition of the United States. There is always this idea of the US containing or trying to contain China and its rise. And on the other hand, the US doesn't trust the ambition that China has in the Asia-Pacific region.
Speaking of the Asia-Pacific region, Shi Ming, one of the ways that the U.S. had intended to try to contain China was the Trans-Pacific Trade and Investment Agreement, TPP. Donald Trump's first act as president was to get out of that agreement. Did he, in essence, hand the rest of Asia to China by doing so?
I don't think the issue is so plain, so simple. We can study China's response upon Trump quitting TPP. Many people supposed that China would step in building up other trade allies, alliance with Southeast Asia. It doesn't happen yet, and China is not intended, apparently, to do that. Instead, China, despite all the declaration of protecting of free trade, China pursues something else. China pursued, for example, in East Europe, just one-sided investment without any fair play for the protection of investment. China shut down the own market for European enterprises. It is not just the policy of Xi Jinping, but Xi Jinping continues. And I think it is quite obvious that the United States, in some term, just follow China's example. Donald Trump says America first. China doesn't say that, but China acts in that sense. China first. Why not?
Well, actually, the Chinese ambassador to the U.S. said if the U.S. says America first and we need to protect ourselves from the trade deficit, it's like looking in a mirror. So what you just said is reflected on the Chinese side as well.
And in fact, Andreas Kluth said to us a little bit earlier that certainly Donald Trump, that China is not going to be looking to play a values-based leadership role, but that's hardly what Donald Trump is looking for either. His approach to foreign policy is explicitly transactional. So what would you say he will be looking for from Xi Jinping in this meeting in China in terms of getting a good deal?
Well, first of all, I just wanted to briefly also respond to your previous question about these trade deals, because to me that illustrates, I mean, that there are bigger issues, North Korea, the South China Sea, that we'll get to, but his response to these two trade deals is, to me, an illustration of his intellectual failure and perhaps of the entire group around him to understand the issue of China's rise and America's relative decline. Because in the Trans-Pacific Free Trade Deal, he had an opportunity of all the Pacific regions with America, but without China, to tie them together. At the same time, he had an opportunity to do the same thing with the Transatlantic Free Trade Area, to bind the traditional West closer together. And he said, out of a protectionist impulse, totally misguided, no to both, allowing China, he could have contained China just in that context quite well, allowing China to rise and taking America out of it, forcing all these other countries, third countries, to look for leadership elsewhere. So just in that, I'll stop there for now, but I just wanted to get that in.
And just briefly, what would you say Donald Trump will be looking for from Xi Jinping in this meeting?
I think he's interested in anything that'll, both with Germany, which has a larger trade surplus towards America than with China, he looks for anything that allows him to declare victory in that issue. They're exploiting us by selling more to us than we sell to them. A rhetorical point mainly, because he's not going to succeed. And he's going to really concentrate on North Korea, getting the China to solve this problem and possibly dropping more threats that if they don't, he will solve the problem, which would not be a solution at all. And I think the South China Sea may come up, and I doubt that Taiwan will come up because I consider that stable.
So we talked about what the two leaders might have in common, that transactional approach. But another thing, of course, is their willingness and desire to lay claim to power. Xi misses no opportunity to reinforce the notion of China's superpower status, and he has thrown to the wind the former self-imposed restraint of Chinese leaders.
A show of strength by China to assert dominance in Asia and the world. The conflict over islands and marine rights in the South China Sea has been smoldering for years, with both China and neighboring states laying claim. That has also repeatedly sparked disputes with the U.S. Another showdown is with North Korea over nuclear weapons. Trump expects Xi to send stronger signals reining in North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. China is also expanding economically, investing worldwide. The country is staking its claim in Africa in the contest over valuable natural resources. China no longer wants to be the West's factory. It wants to drive its own innovations. In addition, it's the largest creditor of the U.S. Is China on its way to becoming the world's new #1 superpower?
So, Shi Ming, certainly Donald Trump will be looking to give some kind of message on North Korea. He has repeatedly said he wants to see China exercise more influence over North Korea. Can it and will it?
I'm not sure. China has done two little steps ahead of this visit of Donald Trump in Beijing. The one is China has joined more international sanctions, including shutting up all enterprises of North Korea in China. And the other is China tried to pave the way to set up a new relationship to South Korea, just to reduce the tensions and so on. And if Donald Trump comes to Beijing, Xi Jinping might say to them, my friend, I've done all what I can. What can you demand more? I've done.
Would you expect any of that to make any difference in North Korea's behavior?
No, not at all.
Gudrun Wacker, speak to North Korea as well, if you like, but I'd also like to ask about the South China Sea. It is rated by many experts as one of the most volatile geopolitical hotspots in the world. Could we see it become, in fact, the site of a hot conflict?
Well, hot conflict, it can always spiral out of control, but I think so far we see that all sides try to sort of keep it, within limits. Actually, you could have expected more after the ruling of The Hague, but because there was a government change in the Philippines, it made it possible to reopen the door for a better relationship between the Philippines and China. On North Korea, I think that China will not do more, cannot do more, probably because their biggest priority is that North Korea stays on the map. They don't want an implosion of North Korea. They don't want the millions of refugees that come with that. And they don't want a reunited Korean peninsula with American troops at the Chinese border. That's their priority. So on the South China Sea, I think it will depend on what Donald Trump will say in other stations of his trip. I mean, he will go also to Vietnam, to the APEC summit. It is rumored that there will be a speech about open and free oceans. So there will be some announcement of concerning the Indo-Pacific. And for the Chinese, the word Indo-Pacific alone is a no-go. They talk of the Pacific Ocean and the Indian Ocean, but not of both as a connected thing. So I think there will be some counter-movements led by Japan, Australia, India, and the United States. And so I don't see that the facts on the ground will change.
Andreas Kluth, is it possible that if Donald Trump doesn't get at least the appearance of stronger Chinese action on North Korea, that he could turn sour? Some people say one of the reasons he's been making nice is that he has kept on hoping China might exercise some leverage there. And if this relationship were to go sour, either because of the South China Sea or because of North Korea, what consequences would that have?
Well, I'm sort of smirking because you asked me if it's possible that Donald Trump could unexpectedly turn sour. And I mean, that's the whole thing about Donald Trump is the unpredictable, and sour is not even the word. Just look at his tweets at 2 a.m. The scary thing is, or by the way, it's ironic that Taiwan, which was for many decades the big issue, really appears stable, given that on one side and on the other side we have these much more dangerous conflicts. And what makes them so dangerous is that, in my opinion, China is the only rational actor of all the ones involved, of the three major ones involved, because North Korea, well, is maybe rational, but is difficult. And now Donald Trump, he may just be faking to be being mad, or he may be it. And I think it's completely unpredictable. The Chinese side of it was, Gudrun described it very well. I think with Donald Trump at the helm on the other side, it's become totally unpredictable. And I think that could blow up. In the South China Sea, I think it is inevitable that sooner or later we will, in that Chinese, what they consider a Chinese pond, the rest of the world cannot back down and say these are international waters. You cannot build on your islands permanent aircraft carriers, so that will lead to conflict.
And what kind of conflict and what kind of intentions do you think we will see from China in regard to the South China Sea? If we look at the Party Congress, Shi Ming Xi said very strongly China will defend its interests, and China has been investing heavily in cutting-edge military technology. Would you say China will not back down when it comes to the South China Sea, and could we then, in fact, see a conflict arise?
You are virtually taking the word out of my mouth. I think the strongest message of Xi on the last Party Congress is to make China's army at the top of the world, not just China's economy, but China's army within short time until
2049. It's still a little way to go.
So, hot conflict, yes or no?
Yeah, yes. I suppose even militarily.
Okay. Somber closing words. Thank you very much for being with us, and thanks to all of you out there for tuning in. See you soon.